Okay, now we're ready for the 1920s Part 2. Unit 3A is the 1920s, and I'm going to include enough information so you can tell by looking at the title of the part what it's going to deal with. So we're still dealing with background things that cause people to be extraordinarily nervous and rattled and fearful in the year 1919, laying them open, making them vulnerable to the mass panic that was the Red Scare. And we're not really up to the scare itself yet. We're still looking at what's going on. We've seen that a lot of people were nervous about the rapid pace of change. The culture seemed to be changing. The culture, in fact, seemed to be deteriorating. The war hastened that on several fronts. Wars always have a coarsening effect, and this one did too. You have a number of just unsettling things that happened in the year 1919. It's a very stressful year. You had a very sharp post-war economic recession. You're discharging, that's the word I was looking for, discharging over 4 million veterans into an economy with a collapsing job market. There's not room for them. So many of them are jobless and frustrated, and they're going to look for somebody to take that out on. And such people as certain despised minorities and immigrant groups, people outside the mainstream, are going to be handy target suspects for this dissatisfaction. The president left the country for 5 months, comes back with this treaty that had some scary looking provisions. Support for it deteriorated. He goes on a cross-country speaking trip and suffers a physical collapse followed by a massive stroke. He's in the White House and the public is being told nothing. The suspicion was that Mrs. Wilson was actually running the country. So all of this adds up. It adds way up. Now, the next big thing will be the fact that 1919 witnessed a massive wave of strikes by labor unions. As we talked about during the war, prices went up faster than wages did. Now, wages are rising. There's upward pressure because just as if the labor market is glutted, that depresses wages because you hire the most desperate people who work the cheapest. If labor is at a premium, which it was during the war, wages are going to go up, and they did. So people who were still home working their jobs, they're making more money than they ever dreamed they would make, but it's hard to understand why it won't buy as much because price increases outstrip wage increases. Now, during the war, it just seemed too unpatriotic to strike. So these people just tightened their belts and hung on. Once the war is over and once certain legal restrictions have been lifted, there's not a reason not to strike. So there's just this tsunami of labor strikes, which people found deeply, deeply frightening. American workers wouldn't do that. Real American workers wouldn't rebel against their employers like that. Only if radical aliens are misleading them could this happen. The number of strikes in that 1 year is counted as 3,630. You figure that's just under 10 per day for the whole year. Now today it's so obvious that strikes don't really end up helping anybody. Strikes today are rare, as we see. So, and the number of strikes in 1919 was 9 times as many as in the biggest single year for strikes in the roughly 80 years that have passed since World War II started. Okay? The largest number of strikes in this country in a single year, and I think it was sometime in the 1950s, was just over 400. Okay, the second biggest was just under 300. It's been in the 2 digits now for a long time. 3,600 strikes. Are you kidding me? Now, there were 3 of them that were particularly significant for different reasons. In January 1919, and this is one of the first ones, there was what is called a general strike in Seattle, Washington. All the trade unions and the pattern in organized labor is still tends toward there being unions of workers with specific skills banding together. So all the trade unions went out on strike for 5 days. Are they striking for anything in particular? Not really. They're just flexing their muscles. They're just doing this to demonstrate the power that they have and what they can do to the economy if they don't get some things going their way. Well, the mayor of Seattle was on record publicly as speculating that the Bolsheviks were behind this. Communist infiltrators had led this strike, and so that's going to feed into the idea of blaming communists for everything that's going wrong in the country. And since communists tend overwhelmingly to be foreign-born, it bleeds over to foreign-born people being under suspicion. So this accusation was printed up and reprinted all over the country in newspapers. So after 5 days, the strike ends. Okay. A second one that was particularly significant, I'm not sure exactly what part of the year this took place, I think on up in the spring, the police force went out on strike in Boston, Massachusetts. And there was a great disturbance in the force because even today, the most liberal day we've ever had, we don't really tolerate the police or firefighters going on strike. Now, that might not be the case within the last year or so, where there's serious people thinking we'd just be better off if we didn't have any police. Let's just defund them and get rid of them. But generally speaking, no, that's not on the table. Plus, today, Boston is among the most far out, quote, liberal, unquote, cities. I hesitate to honor them with that epithet in the country. 100 years ago, it may have been the most conservative. So for the police of all people to strike in Boston of all places, that just couldn't happen. There was predictably a crime wave. The cops are on strike. Let's go for it. So, and this strike was settled. It didn't just go on indefinitely, but it casts an odd shadow. The governor of Massachusetts sent a very curt note to old Samuel Gompers, who was somehow still alive, still head of the American Federation of Labor, informing him, quote, that there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime, quote unquote. Well, that got very wide coverage, and it actually, for the governor of Massachusetts, it scored him the vice presidential nomination on the Republican ticket in 1920. He's running with Warren G. Harding. The ticket won, so Calvin Coolidge, former governor of Massachusetts, became the president of the United States, first vice president, and then President Harding died of, as far as we know, natural causes in August of 1923, put Calvin Coolidge in the White House, and he was elected to a term in his own right in 1924. Okay, the third noteworthy strike involves steel workers. In September 1919, just as about the same month as President Wilson falling ill and dropping out of sight, roughly 350,000 steelworkers went out on strike. I probably wouldn't have been out there with them if that's the job I had had. Okay, working in a steel mill is not pleasant. It's actually quite dangerous, and they work incredibly long days. Well, steel workers often work 12-hour days, 7-day weeks. When's the weekend? Well, that's when you just lay out and hope nobody notices. And their hourly wage is about half the average for industrial workers in other industries. They went out on strike. Now, there were no negotiations. All right, the management did not recognize the unions as agents of the workers, so there were no negotiations. The unions they're doing this just on desperation. They're not really ready. They have not laid by strike funds, which unions routinely have done almost ever since, where they can pay minimum substitute wages to their members so they won't starve to death. So once the starvation starts to hit, the steelworkers come crawling back, one or two at a time, tails between their legs, metaphorically speaking, and the strike was crushed. The strike is over. The union ceased to exist, and there were never even any negotiations. Final score: management 100, labor 0. And by the way, public opinion, including the news media, were 100% behind the management. And this was blamed on the communists, the Bolsheviks. So the wave of strikes. Okay. So, were there actually any communists in the United States? Well, yes, there were socialists, there were anarchists, there were communists. Socialists, only a few years earlier, had been not that controversial. As of 1912, like 36 cities in the United States had socialist mayors they'd run and been elected as socialists. But now they're severely being seen as the secret causes of all the problems the country was having. So, as I may have said earlier, we had two different communist parties. In one of them, some of the leaders could speak English, and the other one, nobody could. So, yes, they're out there. The question is not whether they existed. The question is whether they pose any immediate threat. And the Red Scare is going to be about a fear that they did pose an immediate threat. And probably they did not, but whatever the cause, if they actually did what I'm about to describe, they picked a really bad time to start calling attention to themselves. Because in the spring of 1919, there were a number of violent acts, or specifically bombings. For example, parties still unknown, sent packages in the mail addressed to a sort of all-star cast of national leaders, famous people, that sort of thing. And these packages contained bombs set to go off when the package was opened. Okay, the first one was delivered to the home of a United States senator who, ironically, if there was a friend of the immigrant in the Senate, it would have been him. Anyway, senators often don't open their own mail. His maid opens the package. It blew up. It blew her hands off. There's no pill for that. That's striking a blow for the little guy, isn't it? Well, the next morning in Chicago, a postal worker was riding the commuter train to work that morning, was reading a story about it in the newspaper, and described the package, what kind of paper, what kind of return address, all that. He remembered seeing a bunch of packages just like that at the post office previous day, so as soon as he got to work, he hurries back and finds that the packages are all still there. Fortunately, none of the others had been delivered. The police are called, and they find that every single package contained a bomb. Well, this was laid at the feet of anarchists, socialists, communists. But we don't know. Okay? Did it fit their actual profile or just a suspected profile? Either way. And someone attempted to bomb the residence of the Attorney General of the United States, a man who goes by his middle initial first name, A. Mitchell Palmer. Now, the Palmers were not home when the bomb went off. It damaged the porch of the house, and the only casualty was the bomber, because they found human remains in the wreckage. Presumably, the device went off prematurely. Some joker said all they found were two left legs. That's got to be a joke. But they found enough to identify the bomber as an Italian immigrant known to be an anarchist. So that looks solid. And the press coverage promoted Attorney General Palmer to vast popularity, and he then took advantage of that and played off that to become the leader of the Red Scare, as we shall see.